Hi students, welcome to class. Today we're going to be talking about sexualities. So let's get started. We have quite a few different concepts and theories that we need to cover. One of them is how we do sexuality. We're going to talk about the erotic marketplace, sexual spectating, the male gaze, subjectification and objectification, the sexual script, which we all know, even though we don't know how we learned it. It's very interesting in that regard. And the politics of respectability. So, how do we do sexuality, right? So one of the things that we don't actually realize that we learn kind of through passive media culture or through our interactions with others is something called the sexual scripts. Now, we all tend to follow the sexual scripts that is both heterosexuals and sexual minorities. And that means that we follow these rules, these unwritten rules that we've all learned, and we've been prescribed these rules. It tells us kind of like who we're supposed to be sexually interested in, what we're supposed to be doing, and how we're supposed to be engaging in sexual intimacy. And so you're probably thinking, wait, nobody ever told. Um, Interestingly enough, you don't really know how you learned it, but you know if somebody breaks the rules. So a good example of this is in How I Met Your Mother. In that TV show, one of the characters, he would break the sexual script rule. And what he would do was he would just invite a girl over and then be standing there naked when she showed up. And he said it would work like half the time, right? Some of the girls would freak out and run off, and some of them would stay and have sex. Well, he was breaking a rule. And this rule is essentially a prescribed kind of set. In the text, it goes through this, and it essentially says, like, okay, the rule is you kind of be close to each other first if you want sexual intimacy, right? If you're getting sexually intimate or if you're getting close to somebody. So, like flirting and close encounters, like standing really close, touching lightly, maybe somebody's hands, kissing, closed mouth before open mouth, um, fondling, so above the waist first before you move to below the waist. Um, and then below the waist, if clothes come off, it's always in a heterosexual relationship, it's always girls' top comes off, then the guys, girls' bottoms come off, then the guys. Um, if it's a sexual minority, then it is essentially a toss-up whose clothes come off first, with sexual intercourse being one of the last things. The guy's always the motivator generally, and if women are the initiators, it's also breaking part of that sexual script. Um, so it really kind of tells us like the how and what and when. And even though nobody's ever told you that, we do know that if you break the rules, people will let you know. And we kind of glean them mostly through media, but they are there. Um, and a lot of the times, things like how we do sexuality or sexual scripts, and even our idea of what equality is or a sexual revolution is, um, are taught to us through socialization of like mass media, different institutions, like family and friends and interactions with others, right? So a lot of times, people think of the sexual revolution as the just say yes. And think about it yourself. Like, do you equate sexual revolution with the idea that women should just say yes or just want to have sex, right? Or is sexual revolution for you only the idea that women should want to have more sex and not that men also have the right to say no or not want to be overly sexually active, right? Because we talk a lot about sexual equality, and instead of um, creating equality for both sexes, what we do is try to get women to behave as though we think men should behave. And so, yes, women should have the right to be more sexually active if they want to, right? And a lot of women do, especially if you are young, if you tend to have more testosterone as a woman. Um, so women, just kind of a reiteration, is something we talked about at the beginning of the semester. Women are more sensitive to testosterone and men are more sensitive to estrogen. So we both have testosterone and estrogen in our systems. Women with what we call high testosterone tend to be more interested in sex and also have better visual spatial abilities and might be a little more aggressive, like even with like violence and that kind of stuff. But it's that women are more sensitive to testosterone, so we don't need as much testosterone in our system to have the same effects as it would on a man. And vice versa, the opposite is also true in regards to estrogen. But we also deny men the right to not engage in sexual activity if they're not interested in it. Men are often pushed into this idea that they're supposed to want to have sex with just any woman, that they're not supposed to be interested in a relationship or love first, that they are somehow not completely a man if they're seeking intimacy and partnership prior to a sexual relationship, or if they don't just simply want to have sex. If you do that, right, if you try to make everybody into this idea of what men should be, more these sexual aggressors, that's not equality, right? So equality is giving the freedom to everybody to express their sexuality the way they want. Women should have the freedom to be more sexually, to explore their sexuality more or be more sexually active if they choose. But men should also have the same types of freedoms as well. So that would be what a real kind of sexual revolution is. So in our contemporary rules of society regarding sexuality, a lot of times what we're doing is we're saying that men should be a little bit more and women should be a little bit less. Meaning, so in our culture, we have something called an erotic marketplace. And an erotic marketplace is this kind of abstract space where people are organized according to how desirable we think that they are sexually. So how attractive are you? How well off are you? What's your education? What is your future potential? What is your health? All these things, right? So where do you live? What do you have? Those kinds of things. That's the erotic marketplace. And so theoretically, we should all find somebody who we're fairly compatible with. But the erotic marketplace also creates a ceiling, kind of a glass ceiling on women's level of success. And that's because, according to our culture's matching rules, and a lot of cultures' matching rules, in a heterosexual relationship, we expect the man to be a little bit more. What do we mean by that? So often we think of like, oh, men should earn a little more money than women, right? They should be a little more financially successful. They should have a little bit more education, a little taller, a little heavier, a little bit older, right? And when we break these rules, especially when it comes to financial success, when women earn more than men, or they're more successful in their career, or they're more educated than the man, especially if it's a big gap. Both men and women, but especially men, are really uncomfortable with this, right? So what it says is that men essentially should be more accomplished than women, just enough. So we don't mean equal. When you say you're equally matched, an old religious term even is equally yoked, right? You might have heard that old religious term, meaning you're similar to someone else. But when we say that, we mean just a little more for the men and just a little less for the women. because it makes both parties uncomfortable when women have more. And this disadvantages women. And overall, it also privileges men, right? So, for example, if a man says, I have a family and a wife to take care of, he will often be given more work at work. He might be given a promotion or access to getting a promotion to making more money because other people assume he needs to take care of his family. Whereas if a woman says that, she often will be penalized in her career. If she talks about, oh, I have a family to take care of, she can often end up not getting the job because her employer will assume she will have to leave work all the time. She will be given less hours because it's assumed she needs to do all the domestic and child labor. And she will often be not given the promotion, right, as well, because she has other obligations. So it creates a situation where women tend to be overall disadvantaged and men tend to be overall kind of slightly more privileged according to these rules of our society. So in addition to that, especially within our media, and this is what we were talking about, where we learn a lot about the sexual script, that rule. It's literally like a script. It's like a set of rules, right? I was kind of explaining to you, where we learn these rules. And so one of the big things with the media is it creates storylines where for the most part, men are the center of action. They're the real character. They're the only characters with depth. Most of the time, they're men out. So in real life, women outnumber men. More male babies are born, but men die at a higher rate when they're young, and then because of activity that is more reckless, right? They tend to get into more car accidents or motorcycle accidents than girls. Then when they get older, they tend not to go to the doctor, so they're more likely to die from heart attack or diabetes when they're in their like 40s and 50s. By the time you get into your 80s, women outnumber men really by far, right? Because we also outlive men. But in our media, men outnumber women, and it's like a huge number, right? So most of the time, all the characters are men, all the main characters are men, always like the main character is the man. Women are kind of they're like additives, so they're there either just as a sexual interest or a love interest, or if there's two or more women and they actually talk, which is kind of rare, they're talking about the guy. And all the point of view in movies is from the male perspective, specifically from the heterosexual male gaze, right? So what is that? So I have a few pictures for you so you can kind of see it. The one on the bottom is a really good example. So we're always looking at everything, but especially women's bodies through the heterosexual male gaze. So it is designed to appeal to heterosexual men. And it's about looking at women's bodies, looking at women from a sexually subjective perspective, meaning to acknowledge and reconfirm and prescribe male sexual desires, right? Women are really become, if not comfortable, you come to understand that you're always under the sexual male gaze. And so you, especially for young women, they often feel like they could be objectified and feel like it's the perception of sexual subjectification, right? So especially for young women, they might internalize that everything that you are is just your sex appeal. So it's all about how pretty and sexually desirable you are to men. So what you look like, what you wear, even your accomplishments or what activities you should be interested in are all with the acknowledgement and understanding that it's about your sex appeal for heterosexual men. And women will internalize this, including internalizing the sexual script, because we understand we're sexually subjectified. And once you reduce a person to solely that, that's called sexual objectification. So it's that process by which somebody, especially women, are presented as objects for desire by others. And we see that constantly in the media. One of fembots are a good example of this. Or, headless women. The heterosexual male gaze is great for this, right? So you see pictures here. None of these women have faces, if you notice, right? Because it's all about objectifying and the sexual objectification of their bodies and the heterosexual male gaze. So a woman's intellect or personality or whole person is not necessary for the heterosexual male gaze. It actually gets in the way. This is also why heterosexual men become really uncomfortable when they're in gay male spaces, because they're actually very rarely, if ever, the object of sexual objectification or sexual subjectification. And so they might become very angry and hostile and react with violence when they realize that they are the object of the heterosexual male gaze. And a privilege that many heterosexual men have is they don't even realize, even with their own daughters or children, that is something that women live with on a day-to-day basis, not just in the media, not just when they go out to nightclubs, but even if they are going to work, going to school, just hanging out with friends, they are and know that they are being sexually objectified. So one of the things that occurs because of this is women, as they internalize this, if you learn this and internalize this when you're really young, and then you don't seek other avenues for developing your sense of self, like if you don't have anything else, if you are just only how pretty you are, or how desirable you are sexually, it can lead to a real crisis, because as women age, they by default become less sexually desirable, and they're no longer part of that sexual gaze. It's almost solely focused on young women. And so if you learn to think of yourself as an object of pleasure for others when you're really young, as you get older, and you haven't developed maybe other interests, you don't have a career, you don't have intellectual interests, you don't have hobbies, you haven't developed any character in any other regard, it can be devastating to you as a person as a whole, because you lose your entire identity. It also means that you're probably less likely to enjoy things like sex. So this idea of, or this concept, sexual spectating, what it is, and both men and women can do it, but it's more common for women to do it, is you're monitoring your own sexual performance. So while you're having sex, you are concerned about what you look like, to the male gaze especially, right? How you're coming off, what you sound like, does it sound right? Do you look right? You don't look unsexy while you're having sex, right? And it's to your own detriment, because if you are so focused in on sexually spectating, which is monitoring your own sexual performance, you're less likely to actually be enjoying sex. So here's just the technical definition. So the sexual script is the institutionalized rules for sexual interactions. We've all learned this. Everybody has learned this. We've all internalized this. And everybody follows these rules regardless of your sexual identification. So you can't be like, oh, well, I'm part of the queer community, so I don't follow the sexual script. Or I'm different than everybody else, I don't follow the sexual script. You follow the sexual script. If you don't follow the sexual script, people often will react with confusion or fear or violence towards you, right? Depending. It's quite rare. We can kind of jump around or make some modifications, especially like, for example, if you've been with somebody for a long time, you can skip the first steps. But still, for the most part, we do tend to follow the sexual script. We tend to follow those rules that I was laying out for you, right? Kissing before intercourse, top off before bottoms off, right? Or especially if you're new, like petting is above the waist first and then below the waist. So those types of things. And that's regardless of whether you are straight, gay, lesbian. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. You're gonna follow those, and we all learn them, and we all internalize them. And I think it's mostly from the media, and then also negative sanctions. But we don't know for sure. Like you're not gonna have like a oh I learned it from here kind of situation. You probably didn't even realize that it was something that you learned and followed. Part of the sexual script is something called the push and resist dynamic. Excuse me. So the push and resist dynamic is connected to rape culture. And the push and resist dynamic is the expectation that our culture sets for men to push sexual activities and the expectation and responsibility for women to slow or stop sexual activities. So the reason why we think it's part of rape culture, or we say it's part of rape culture, it is clearly, is because it's the idea that it's men should be seeking sexual gratification and women inherently don't want sex, and so it's their moral responsibility to stop it, right? So the rape culture itself, by the way, I put up a couple Disney, this is a good example of rape culture. Also the Beast too, like Beauty and the Beast. This guy was very I forget his name, but he was very pushy. But the Beast also was an abusive male, and she somehow changed this monster into like her prince. This is also not something we should be teaching little girls, but we do learn like you can change any guy into your prince. Okay, so this might be a little disconnected because I had to go back. So we were talking about the push and resist dynamic and its connection to rape culture. And rape culture in general is an environment that neutralizes kind of behavior where men are sexually aggressive. It justifies it. It even glorifies sexual coercion or sexual violence. It's the idea that all men want to continue to push sexual aggression, and that if a woman doesn't stop it or she puts herself in a situation where she can't stop it, that men are somehow justified in doing that, and women are somehow deserving of being raped, right? And that's rape culture, right? And it's not just offensive to women. Think about this. It's very few men who would ever actually do something like that, who would ever actually rape a woman. It's a very small percentage of men. But rape culture envelops a set of socialized standards around the push and shove dynamic, right? Around this idea that men should be aggressors. So those few men who are sexual aggressors, they kind of get a sense of protection from that. And it's because we tend to blame women and not men. We tend to expect men to be the sexual aggressors. And the truth is, most men would never, ever, ever rape a woman, even if, not only if she's wearing something revealing or short or low cut, right? But even if she was walking down the street naked, men have control over their own bodies and their own desires just like women do. And so this idea that it's women's responsibility to control men's sexual behavior is unfair to women, but it's also extremely unfair to most men as well, because it lumps them in with the type of men who take advantage of this and are part of the actual rape culture, and who do, or actually part of why rape culture is so bad, right? Most rapes are never reported because of the blame we put on women. Our culture, our institutions tend to not penalize men for sexual assault. Most of them never go to jail. Our college institutions tend to not penalize males for raping girls within the institution. Oftentimes, women are pushed out of the college; they end up going somewhere else. So they're the ones that lose. Um, we don't believe women. We blame women. And then we put women on trial as though, if they do bring it to trial, as though they're the ones to blame, that they may, oh, she was a bad girl, or she got too drunk, or she wasn't wearing the right thing, right? And as both a man and a woman, we know that most men would absolutely never, no matter how drunk a girl is, no matter where she is, no matter what she's wearing. And so rape culture is not just detrimental to women, it's very detrimental to men as well. Okay, so this brings us to what we call the orgasm gap. So the orgasm gap is the gap between the number of times women are likely to have orgasms in when they're having heterosexual or sexual encounters versus the number of times men are likely to have orgasms. Our culture tends to be heteronormative, and our sexual binary focuses not just on men but on male orgasms. And it teaches us, both men and women, that men are more deserving of sexual pleasure than women, especially when it comes to casual encounters. Um, Men and women, but men especially, don't feel the responsibility for promoting a woman's orgasm during a sexual encounter. And women are actually discouraged from pursuing their own orgasm during a sexual encounter. And sexual spectating comes into this as well, because you are, if you are very concerned with what you look like and male orgasm, and women, especially during first encounters, tend to be more sexually giving, whereas men tend to be more sexually selfish. And then it shifts as the relationship grows. So men are more sexually giving as they become interested in a relationship, or as the encounters increase. Then it leads to kind of this huge gap, and what's called the orgasm gap. So only about 20 to 30% of women tend to have orgasms regularly when they have sex with heterosexual partners, while about 75% of men tend to have orgasms regularly when they have sex with their heterosexual partners. This isn't uniform. Some of us would say, oh, well, it's just easier for a man to have an orgasm. And the data doesn't necessarily support that. Because what happens when it's two women together, or if women are alone and they're masturbating, the percentage of women having orgasms, the rate, increases to above 90%. So when it's two women together, women tend to have orgasms at about 90% of the time that they're having a sexual encounter, and it's almost 100% of the time when they're masturbating. So it's not that women aren't capable of having orgasms all of the time, it's that our culture and our ideologies surrounding and our practices surrounding women's sexual pleasure create a situation where the activity and the intent is not on a woman's orgasm. It's focused on the male orgasm. Oh my gosh, friends, I am struggling with this particular uh, lecture more than I normally struggle. So those of you who are in my class currently, you kind of know why. But this is going to be a rough one. I'm sorry that they're a little bit choppy. Let's talk a little bit about hookup culture. So the same person who wrote your book, your gender book, also wrote a book on, she did a lot of research on hookup culture. Now she works at kind of a upper class private university. She did research with, it was like, I think 6,000 students, 6,800 students or so, both interviews in person, or not in person, but qualitative interviews, and then they did a ton more that were quantitative interviews as well. And so that's where a lot of this research and information comes from. So hookup culture, we have kind of two different views of it. There's the idea that we get from the media, and the media essentially says or tells us that all college students are always partying, always having a ton of sex, always hooking up with each other, right? And then there's like Lisa Wade's research, and that shows us that that's not necessarily the case, right? So hookup culture is the culture of, or the idea that you can, you get to have fun. When you go into college, it's your time to explore, it's your time to have fun, it's your time to have sexual encounters, all of these things, right? That's hookup culture. The idea of a hookup changes. Now, she defines hookup as, one or more sexual encounters, not necessarily intercourse. So some type of activity with a person that you meet. Now, people who are younger might define, people have very different definitions of hookup. And so it's everything from just like kissing and making out, that's how some people define it, all the way to it has to actually be intercourse, right? So there's a varying definition. Not everybody defines it the same. So she's explaining to us how she defines it, which is what all researchers tend to do. It's called a conceptualization of a definition. Especially in sociology, we have to do that. We have to make a clear, distinct definition, so we're not working with different definitions. And she talks about who participates in hookup culture and who doesn't. And so who participates? For the most part, who participates is people of privilege, so high socioeconomic status, upper middle class or higher, students who live on campus versus living at home, students who are not commuters, students who do not have to work while they go to college. So students who are having not only their college paid for, but also their living expenses paid for. What does this allow them? This allows them a lot more time to party, time to hang out, time to drink, privacy. So they're living in dorms, so they're more likely to, they're not under supervision of a parent. The type of school you attend, so most likely private schools. Students who are going to community college or publics, or like Cal State schools, like those kind of state schools, they're less likely to participate in hookup culture. Also, students of color and sexual minorities, so all minorities in general, right? So who doesn't participate as often? Well, people in the queer community are less likely to participate in hookup culture. Why? Partially because hookup culture is essentially specifically geared towards heterosexual hookups, right? So hookup culture is kind of geared towards heterosexual. It's very heteronormative. But also, students in the queer community have less opportunities. So maybe 1 in 5 people are in the queer community. So 4 out of the 5 people, right? So you're going to say 4 out of the 5 people are not even somebody you would be interested in. And then even within that, that's talking about everybody. So everybody who's gay, everybody who's lesbian, everybody who's transgender, they still have a limited number there. So you're just not meeting as many people, right? Also, who else is not necessarily participating? And that's mainly students of color and students who don't have a lot of financial privilege. So Students who are racial minorities in any way, shape, or form are much less likely to participate in hookup culture because of something we call the politics of responsibility. And the politics of responsibility is actually huge, right? It's this idea that you have to behave, you have actually less privilege or freedom to act out because you're a person of color, because you then become the representative of your entire group. So if you're part of the dominant group, in this case white, and especially privileged economically and white, you have much more privilege to engage in behavior that might not seem very respectable in everyday life, because you're experimenting or it's okay because it's fun, but also mostly because you're not a representative for your entire racial group, right? Whereas if you're a student of color, especially Hispanic or Black, you are always a representative of your entire group. And so any little activity that you do that might be out of bounds is going to be seen or viewed as worse. Like if you were to smoke marijuana, then all people like you smoke marijuana. Or you were to have sex with someone for fun, then oh my gosh, all people like you are just really sexually promiscuous, right? And so to avoid that, and because you've learned that your whole life and you know that you don't have that privilege, you play the politics of respectability, and you are very much responsible for doing that. And I'm looking at this now, and somehow it changed politics of respectability to politics of responsibility, and I didn't notice it when I was editing, so please ignore that part. That must have been like the spell check. And as usual, I'm not changing it. It's such a pain to go back and fix things and then do the video all over again. So other reasons why you're not going to participate: where you live. If you live at home, you're definitely just not going to bring people home. If you work and go to school, if you commute and go to school, you just have less time, right? So if you're working class, if you are living off campus and going to school, right? And most people at your school are also doing the same, you're just much less likely to participate in that hookup culture. Okay, that's it for today. So, thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.